Good evening and welcome to this plenary session. My name is and I'm delighted to introduce Professor Dennis Pausch as the keynote of this plenary session. My panel co-organizers, Drs. Vandenberg and Rojas, were also excited for Professor Pausch to be joining our panel 23, Modes of Textual Engagement and the Reader's Experience in Greco-Roman Historical Narratives. We are honored that he has been chosen and recognized as a rock star headliner at this Festival of Classics in Coimbra. Professor Dr. Pausch is University Professor in the Department of Classical Philology at the Philipps University of Marburg in Germany. His contribution to scholarship is significant. He has published 4 monographs, in addition to 46 articles and book chapters on topics ranging from Cicero's use of comic invective, multi-perspectivity in Suetonius, and clothing and the construction of gender roles in Perversius. Professor Dr. Pausch's most recent monograph, Zeitenmontagen, Vergleichnis Anachronismen als literarische Technique, published in 2023, examines Virgil's use of anachronisms in the Iliad as an intentional technique that Virgil uses to help his original readers. The book looks at instances in which Virgil uses contemporary Roman terms, such as those which belong to Roman military strategies, customs, and architecture, to describe events in the prehistory of Rome. Reviewers have described it as a model of logical construction in an arresting treatment of a subject never systematically studied before, and praised it greatly, with one reviewer writing that every section of the book provoked thought and helped me see new features of the Iliad. Professor Dr. Pausch holds many esteemed positions that reflect his expertise as a scholar of classical philology and Latin literature, as well as his experience as university professor. For brevity, I will only name a few. He is the chair of Latin Studies at Philipps University Marburg, co-editor of Lustrum, International Research Reports on Classical Antiquity, and co-editor of the series Emotions in Antiquity, published by Mozilla. We have been lucky to have Professor Pausch join our panel because of his expertise about the reader experience of ancient historical narratives, which is a key concept for our panel. It's in the name. His chapter in the 2022 volume, Reading History in the Roman Empire, entitled Livy, the Reader Involved, and the Audience of Roman Historiography, demonstrates that Livy wrote the narrative of the war against Hannibal for a reader to experience the full emotional force of the events and come to know the pleasure that reading historiography can bring. His keynote lecture today is entitled Keep on Reading, Strategies Against Fatigue and Apathy in Livy's Urbe Condita. Please welcome Professor Pausch.
Thank you very much, Edward, for the very warm introduction, and of course to the organizers for having me here. Again, it's very good to be in Coimbra. Not working.
Oh. My apologies.
So once again, many thanks for your kind and warm introduction. Many thanks to the organizers for giving me the honor of the plenary lecture. It's very good to be in Coimbra again. I'm a huge fan of the Saltec conference, but I would have missed it this year due to the duties of our ongoing summer term in the German university system. But then I came across the call for papers for the panel organized by Edward Armstrong, Pablo Rojas, and Sanne van der Berg, Modes of Textual Engagement and the Reader's Experience in Greco-Rome Historical Narratives, which is intending to use the categories developed by Rita Felski for better understanding of how ancient historians manage to keep their readers reading their often rather long accounts. And I thought, well, that's exactly my cup of tea, and I will have to find a way to come to Coimbra nevertheless. That then I ended up by giving the plenary lecture is a big and really undeserved honor. Nevertheless, many thanks. What I want to do in the following is firstly to briefly sketch out the idea of the panel that brought me here. Although it's entirely that of the organizers, of course. And then I want to see whether Livy, the author I spent some time working on, will fit into the picture. And perhaps I will not reveal too much in advance when I tell you that he does pretty well so. And if only because he belongs to those writers who, filling no less than 142 books with his words and stories, must have had a rather big interest in keeping his reader moving his hands and his eyes from one scroll to another, even if the reader is beginning to look a bit tired, like the guy on Alma Tadema's painting, so fittingly titled Prose for the lovers of poetry. For Livy, there might have been additional reasons for wishing not to be counted among those historians whose writings Dionysius, in his De Compositione Verborum, describes as being such as no one can bring themselves to read them to an end. By this I mean, and then he continues by giving some names, Philachos, Duris, Polybius, Psasion, and so on, and countless others. A whole day will not suffice to list all their names. Apart from the shame to be included into such a hall of fame of the most boring historians of all times, there might have been economic reasons for Livy to get his reader to keep on going and to buy the next scroll. It is often assumed that everyone in antiquity who could not only read, but who could spend his life writing and was not relying on a wealthy patron, of which there is no sign in Livy, must have been coming from a rich family background, allowing him to do this kind of writing in his leisure time. Although it is not uncontroversial among economic historians, I think we can assume in Rome, at least for the late Republic and the early imperial period, the existence of a book market, not unlike our own, so that it would have been possible, in principle, to earn your living by writing history. For example, by publishing up to 3 books or scrolls every year between the years 30 BC and 17 AD, as Livy seems to have done. If this was the case, Livy, something in our categories between an independent scholar and a skillful popularizer, would indeed have had a most vital interest in ensuring the continuation of the process of reading. Since we know almost nothing about his life, this must remain speculation, and perhaps rightly so. What we do, however, have is his text, or rather those of his 142 books that have survived, which means that indeed they have been read, at least from time to time, to their respective end. And these parts form well-structured thematical units, most prominently in the first pentat, dealing with early Rome, or in the 3rd decade, dealing with the war against Hannibal, and can be seen as a sign too that Livy took the interests of his readers into account, his readers then could buy the scrolls in bundles of 5 or 10, in some way similar to our modern boxes or slipcases where you can buy books in. But this is not the story I want to tell today. It's rather about the narration itself and its contribution to the engagement of the reader, since this is what Rita Felski is interested in too. Among others, in her book from 2028, with the slightly provocative title, Uses of Literature. Like in her more recent publications, that made the idea of what she then calls post-critique even clearer and perhaps somewhat more confrontative. In this early publication, her claim is not least that we read literature not for cognitive reasons alone, but for many other motives too, including economic ones or such ones as related to an academic career. Her main point in her 28th book, however, is to, quote, give equal weight to cognitive and affective aspects of aesthetic response. Any theory worth its salt surely needs to ponder how literature changes our understanding of ourselves and the world as well as its often visceral impact on our psyche. End of quote. After presenting her approach in the introduction, she devotes one chapter each to these four categories, in her words, recognition, enchantment, knowledge, and shock. These have, as the panel organizers point out rightly in their call for papers, quote, some overlap with anagnorisis, beauty, mimesis, and the sublime, which are important and familiar concepts to classical scholars. Some of these scholars, having done indeed important work on the aesthetics and emotion in ancient literature over the last decades, are actually part of this conference. Some of them are even in the audience, and I'm looking really forward to their opinion on these more theoretical issues during the discussion. To start with the more obvious points and my view, so to say, on Felski's take on ancient historiography, Felski's case for a rediscovery of enchantment as part of our reading experience is very much in line with recent efforts to take concepts such as enargeia or fantasia as being emphasized in ancient literary theory more serious, instead of considering them as inferior to our modern, often primarily cognitive approaches. The potential immersion into the narrative resulting from these techniques can also be enhanced by the impact of shock, as Felski has called her fourth category. And it would indeed be an easy task to spend the rest of this paper and perhaps even the rest of the evening discussing the examples cited by Polybius alone of how other Greek historians, in his view wrongly, have tried to stir the emotions of their readers both by cruel details and by unexpected twists of the plot. Yet we now tend to see these authors, for a long time dismissed as exponents of tragic historiography, allegedly an aberration from classical standards resulting from the predominance of rhetoric in Hellenistic times, more positively, is another sign of the ongoing rediscovery of the enchanting qualities of ancient literature. To show just one example of another member of our panel, Lisa Howe's book on the rethinking of Hellenistic historiography that appeared just some weeks ago, is a very good example for this tendency. As to be expected, however, there are several differences as well. So for Rita Felski, recognition is not an element of what is happening in the plot, like two figures recognizing each other, but rather a moment when we recognize ourselves, so to speak, in the text, and when we realize that the story being told is actually about us. This strikes me as a very useful concept for the analysis of historical narratives indeed, because we can read every account of the past both with a more detached attitude, being aware of the chronological distance and the fundamental difference between the figures and the text and our own lives, or we can take a more involved or engaged approach and realize the parallels and resemblance to our own experience. This was shown convincingly by Jonas Gretlein and Luke Houting in a number of publications. I'm showing the 2010 book because the title has the two keywords on it: experience as the more engaged approach versus theology for the more detached one. And indeed, this shift from one way of reading to the other can take several times, even in one and the same narration. And I think it is indeed closely connected to the question of how much we identify ourselves with the historical characters, and hence to Rita Felski's category of recognition. Already this mere act of recognition itself can be connected to an emotional response, often to a kind of shiver, I guess, resulting from its sudden realization. Perhaps even more interesting, however, is the set of subsequent reactions that can take place and that cover a broad range from positive feelings like our side is winning in a conflict, or a person we identify with taking the morally right decision, to less satisfying and more stressful impressions when we realize, for instance, that we might have to face the same situation in the future of our own lives, or that we have already suffered in a similar way in the past, leading to the effect of a re-traumatization as worst-case scenario. When we now bring in her fourth category, knowledge, this can lead us to an even fuller picture of what ancient historians try to achieve. One could argue, at least at first sight, that for Felski, dealing with fictional narratives, the issue of the representation of reality is even more complicated. Since the historiography as it was practiced by Greek and Roman authors, however, includes several elements known to us much better from fictional genres like the novel, the differences might not be too significant in the end. And indeed, one could argue that part of our motivation to read any fictional text put into a historical setting results from our interest to learn something about this period and the way people lived their lives in it. And it's rather obvious that the same holds true for historiography proper. There might be good reasons, therefore, to assume that we will perhaps encounter a different combination of the same motifs for reading, but that the categories employed by Rita Felski might indeed turn out to be useful for a better understanding of how ancient historians try to keep us reading their texts. I will this put to a test now not by discussing some of the more theoretical remarks we have from ancient writers to this issue, besides the already mentioned Dionysius, Plutarch would be a good choice, but by presenting one example from Livy's practice in his urbe condita. And a famous example indeed, or at least a story that is often understood, although in my view wrongly, as a straightforward exemplum of Rome virtus that aims at being imitated by future generations. For that way of perceiving the triple duel of the Horatii and Curiatii, we can perhaps take Jacques-Louis David's 18th century painting as emblematic. Three young men that are willing to risk and even to sacrifice their lives for the good and for the values of their fatherland, here represented by their father, who takes an oath from them before the fighting starts, which only one of them will survive. This, however, is not the whole story we find in Livy, nor it is the whole way he has chosen to tell it. Instead, we will encounter here many of the elements that make his history so much more fascinating than the storehouse of patriotic exemplar it has so often been reduced to. These elements indeed can be described quite successfully by using Felski's categories, and I will try to show in the following where we can find instances of recognition, enchantment, knowledge, and shock. The story is part of the reign of Tullus Hostilius, and therefore, according to Roman belief, placed in what we would call the early 7th century BCE. The new king successfully manages to start a war with Alba Longa, a neighboring city of the closely related Latini. After some skirmishes, it is agreed to seek decision not in a regular battle, but in the form of a duel to be fought by the respective three sibling warriors that by chance are part of both armies, namely the Horatii on the Roman and the Curiatii on the Alban side. This is then laid down in a treaty, reinforced with religious curses for those who were not prepared to recognize the result of the duel, and thus the lasting rule of the victorious city over the defeated one. At the same time, the conclusion of this agreement is used by Livy as the founding story, or the Aition, of the way how international law was performed by the fetial priests up to his own time and to that of his readers. So one could argue that besides the transfer of knowledge about Roman traditions, already here are elements both of recognition and of enchantment at work, because the rituals of the fetiales indeed were admired for their archaic flavor, but must have been familiar to Livy's contemporaries, and hence might have invited them to recognize themselves in the characters of the story told here, despite the fact that they are separated from them by more than 6 centuries of history. At this stage, we now can take a look at Livy's narration itself, although I will use the words of B.A. Foster's translation from 1919, which is still waiting to be replaced as part of the ongoing reworking of Livy in the Loeb series, but whose slightly archaic flavor might have the effect of enchantment too, at least to some of you. When the treaty had been established, the brothers armed themselves in accordance with the agreement made before, namely all 6 of them, so the 3 pairs. On either side of the soldiers, urged on their champions. They reminded them that their fathers' gods, their native land, their parents, and all their countrymen, whether at home or with the army, had their eye only on their swords and their right hands. Eager for combat as well, owing to their native spirit as to the shouts of encouragement which filled their ears, the brothers advanced into the space between the 2 lines of the battle. What is effective in drawing us into the story here is the double focalization, both from their own point of view and from the perspectives of their comrades and countrymen. Such elements had rightly been shown as a crucial element how Livy presents history by Andrew Felter in his 1998 book titled Spectacle and Society. That the strong emotional engagement of an internal audience is used to stimulate and to prefigure the reactions of the external readers is, of course, a long-established practice, best known perhaps from Thucydides' description of the naval battle in the harbor of Syracuse, intensely observed by the Athenian soldiers on the shores, and referred to as a prime example of this technique already by several ancient authors. What is of particular interest in Livy's scene for me is how the impact of being in the center of attention is tied back to the self-perception of the protagonists, not only explicitly in the last part when their ears are filled with the shouts of encouragement, but already in the lines above when all eyes are on their swords and right hands. We are brought here to experience together with them not only the encouragement, but also the demanding expectations of their audience, and hence the pressure that lies on them before their performance. And if we are prepared to accept the parallel also to less bloody and less historically decisive competitions, then this can be a strong stimulus for recognition. And we can almost see us in their place, so to speak, being nervous or anxious before the beginning of a piano concert, a tennis match, or an academic paper. But also, the further description is more about our emotional responses than about those of the audience in the 7th century BCE becomes even clearer in the next passage. The 2 armies were drawn up, each in front of its own camp, no longer in any immediate danger, but a concern as great as ever. And no wonder, since empire was staked on those few men's valor and good fortune. Alert, erecti, therefore, and in suspense, the Latin word really is suspensi, they concentrated their attention upon this unpleasing spectaculum. Even if suspendere, literally meaning something like to be hanging in the air, might not already have developed the full modern sense of suspense as a neurological terminus technicus, it can be used in ancient Latin exactly for the feeling of anxious uncertainty about the further course of events that we relate to this technique. Taken together with the keyword spectaculum, it is therefore not a far-fetched guess to assume that we encounter here a highly self-reflexive passage about the emotional impact that a narrative can have on any, be it internal or external audience. And then we jump into the action that had been anticipated or delayed now for some time. The signal was given, and with drawn steel, like advancing battle lines, the 6 young men rushed to the charge, breathing the courage of great armies. Neither side thought of its own danger, but of the nation's sovereignty or servitude, and how much from that day forward their country must experience the fortune they should themselves create. The instant they encountered, there was a clash of shields and a flash of glittering blades, while a deep shudder ran through the onlookers who, as long as neither side had an advantage, remained powerless to speak or breath. Then, in the hand-to-hand fight which followed, wherein were soon exhibited to man's eyes not only struggling bodies and the play of the sword and shield, but also bloody wounds, 2 of the Romans fell, fatally wounded, one upon the other, while all three of the Albans were wounded. At the fall of the Romans, a shout of joy burst from the Alban army, while the Rome levies now bade farewell to all their hopes, but not to their anxiety, for they were horror-stricken at the plight of a single warrior whom the three curiatari had surrounded. By now, there might be another form of recognition more dominant than that we are invited to share the experience of the protagonists. Even better, I guess, we can compare our reactions to those of the internal audience. And even if our emotional engagement into the actual event will not be so intense than that of the internal spectators, we can imagine ourselves, nevertheless, to be in a similar situation, and we can recognize their shifting reactions from our own experience. Perhaps not from a gladiatorial fight like Livy's contemporary readers, but for instance from watching an important football match. So, will this World Cup final, or whatever analogy you prefer, come up with another unexpected turn? He, the surviving Rome, happened to have got no hurt, and though no match for his enemies together, was ready to fight them one at a time. So, to divide the attack, he fled, thinking that each of them would pursue him with that speed his wounds permitted. He had already run some little distance from the spot where they had fought when, looking back, he saw that they were following at wider intervals and that one of them had nearly overtaken him. Facing about, he ran swiftly up to his men, and while the Alban host were calling out of the curiatari to help their brother, Horatius had already slain him, and was hastening, flushed with victory, to meet his second antagonist. Then, with a sheer, such as is often drawn from partisans by a sudden turn in a conquest, the Romans encouraged their champion, and he pressed on to the end of the battle. And so, before the third Curiatius could come up, and he was not far off, Horatius dispatched the second. They were now on even terms, one soldier surviving on each side, but in hope and vigor they were far from equal. The one, unscathed and elated by his double victory, was eager for a third encounter. The other dragged himself along, faint from his wound and exhausted with running. He thought how his brothers had been slaughtered before him, and was a beaten man when he faced his triumphant foe. What followed was no combat. The Rome cried exultantly, "Two victims I have given to the shades of my brothers. The third I will offer up to the cause of this war, that Rome may rule Alban." His adversary could barely hold up his shield. With a downward thrust, Horatius buried his sword in the Alban's throat and despoiled him where he lay. The Romans welcomed their hero with jubilations and thanksgivings, and their joy was all the greater that they had come near despairing. It is certainly true and well observed that joyful feelings are intensified when we had to worry about the happy ending of the story or the World Cup final beforehand. Here is more at stake, however. The relief of the onlookers that their side has won against all odds is so huge that it makes them oversee the more problematic aspects of how victory actually was achieved. Already the circumstance that the young hero won by running away turns him not into an example of virtus romana in the proper sense, but rather into an instance of fighting with tricks, and hence what the Romans usually like to blame their enemies for. Even more severe, however, is his decision to kill the last of the curiatari instead of sparing his life, although he apparently was not able to fight anymore. Admittedly, we are not told, neither here nor in the preparations for the triple duel, whether the death of all the fighters of one side was agreed on as a decisive criterion, or if victory could be gained by acknowledging defeat as well. In both cases, however, the victorious Horatian could have waited and taken into his consideration how the audience or his king, for instance, reacted. This is more or less a situation that will often have taken place at the end of a gladiatorial duel, as it is shown on this famous relief from the 1st century BC from Rome, now Munich. The heralds have declared a break with their trumpets, and the victorious fighter has to wait for the decision taken by the audience or by the organizer of the game, later on usually by the emperor. And if we accept this parallel, Horatius' decision to kill his opponent instantaneously might have appeared unusual to Roman readers. To be sure, it can be explained by his extreme situation, and especially as mentioned in the declaration put into his mouth, by the death of his two brothers that have occurred just a moment ago and right before his eyes. And indeed, for the time being, everything seems to have gone well. The dead are buried, and we are told that we can still see their graves at the very spot they have died, so that we, if we were Livy's contemporaries, could go there and in a way reenact the triple duel on the spot. We should not, however, put away our scroll already and go for a walk, because the story is not over yet. The armies then marched home. In the van of the Romans came Horatius, displaying his triple spoils. As he drew near the Porta Capena, he was met by his unwedded sister, who had been promised in marriage to one of the Curiatii. We get this rather important background information, indeed, at this very moment, and not somewhere before in the story. When she recognized on her brother's shoulders the military cloak of her betrothed, which she herself had woven, she loosed her hair and, weeping, called on her dead lover's name. It's not made explicit, but one tends to assume that it was the name of the third of the Curiatii, whom Horatius had killed last, and one could say unnecessarily. It enraged the fiery youth to hear his sister's lamentations in the hour of his own victory, and the nation's great rejoicing. And so, drawing his sword, and at the same time angrily upbraiding her, he ran her through the body. "Begone," he cried, "to your betrothed with your ill-timed love, since you have forgot your brothers, both the dead and the living, and forgot your country. So perish every Roman woman who mourns a foe." I'm not sure if this new bloody turn of the story comes as a surprise or a shock to you. The way Livy has chosen to narrate it, however, suggests that his idea was to present it as something unexpected, despite the already not trouble-free behavior of Horatius in the final stages of the fight itself, and hence as something that can be related to Rita Felski's final category, namely that of shock. This depends, of course, and also often in historiography, on the question of how much previous knowledge of the further events we have or we want to assume for the contemporary readers. On the other hand, it has been shown convincingly that readers are not only willing to suspend their disbelief, but also to forget their knowledge, at least for a moment, and as long as they are deeply enough immersed into a story. We have seen already how much Livy has done to draw us into the depiction of the duel. One could add two further minor points which aim to intensify the effect of surprise and unexpectedness here. First, Livy's decision not to mention in advance the close family relations of the six brothers. Secondly, the rapidness of the narration. One sentence to describe his outrage, and then not more than 8 words to have his sister killed. Only after that, he gives his speech to justify what he had done already. He does so by trying to show that the killing of his sister was necessary because with her tears and by speaking the name of her fiancé alone, she already had put her own interests over that of their family and of the Roman state. Actually, his words recall that of Romulus, who some chapters before had tried to justify the killing of his brother Remus by turning him into the same kind of negative example. So perish everyone, so perish whoever else shall leap over my walls, is the formulation there in chapter 1:7. In the case of the murder of Remus, Livy renders no further discussion about its legitimacy or moral evaluation, although exactly this issue had been debated most intensively in the late Republic and was seen by some as the curse lying on Rome from its very beginning, anticipating the whole period of civil wars and even the end of Rome history itself. In the case of the murder of the sister of Horatius, who remains without name in Livy, but is called Camilla by others, however, we get some more details and a discussion. So we learn directly after the rendering of his words that Horatius failed entirely to convince his audience. Atrox visum et facinus patribus plebique is the wording. Dreadful was the deed both for the senators and the people. The only reason why he is not punished for it immediately is the obvious significance of his victory. He is brought to justice, nevertheless, and the following account of his double trial, firstly before two judges who found him guilty and sentenced him to death, and then before the assembly of the people, is almost as long as the description of the tribal duel itself. Admittedly, he is acquitted in the end, yet not, as Livy explicitly states, because of the jus causae, but only due to the tears of his father, who gave a very moving speech pointing out to the loss of the three children he already suffered and begging the people in the assembly if they really want to make him completely childless. In the end, all of this really turns out to be a story about emotions, how they are presented, and even more, how they are perceived by different audiences, both inside and outside the narration. We cannot only ask ourselves what we would have done in the individual episodes. Would we have found Horatius guilty and sentenced him to death? But we can also look back at how we actually reacted emotionally while reading it and wonder how we would have reacted to it if we had really been present as one of the spectators of the fight, in the crowd gathering at the Porta Capena and witnessing the murder of his sister, or as one of the members of the assembly and thus the jury of his trial. Would we have been influenced by our feelings more or less than the figures in the text had been? If we accept this invitation to recognize ourselves in the story, the narration about the Horatii and the Curatii offers a good example for the close combination of enchantment and shock through emotions, and the historical learning resulting from such emotional experiences. These aspects can indeed fairly well be analyzed by using the categories made prominent by Rita Felski. What remains out of the picture, however, is the multi-perspectivity of Livy's account, namely that we are allowed to perceive the events from various points of view with their respective emotional contexts, and that we are encouraged to evaluate them both according to our own opinion and to that of the historical persons acting or watching within the text. This leads, in my view at least, and of those of so many working on Livy over the last years and decades, to an additional level of historical learning, which is basically about the insight that there is never only one correct or true interpretation of the past, whatever people like Augustus try to tell us. Instead of presenting a collection of clear-cut examples ready to reuse, like the statue galleries of the Summi Viri in the Forum Augustum, or in any national garden of heroes, Livy has found a way to give a place in his history also to the victims who suffered under the triumphs of the victors. Jacques-Louis David, whose painting I somehow misused as typical for the usual reduction of Livy's stories to deliver simple patriotic examples, in fact had a keen eye on this aspect too, and giving a prominent place to Camilla or Horatia, or however we want to call her, on his picture on the left or right side. This part of what is happening in Livy's urbe condita then amounts to what we could call a critical reading, and to the attempt to hear a voice between the lines or behind the surface. Personally, I believe that this is no second voice, if you prefer to call it so, that is hidden behind something. It is right there. It is in the middle of the story or of the painting. You only have to know what you're looking for. Nevertheless, this brings us in a way back to exactly the hermeneutics of suspicion that Rita Felski wanted to avoid by drawing our attention to other qualities of narration as well. But then I've understood at least her book from 2028, not as an attempt to replace one approach by another, but as a plaidoyer for a complementary way of interpretation. And this is, for me, exactly what we find in Livy. Enchantment leads to engagement, engagement leads to critical reflection, and both can not only contribute to our historical learning and knowledge, but also to the fact that we keep on reading despite the length of the work and a lot of centuries covered. And even despite the heat of this afternoon, and if you're feeling a bit better than the women on the picture, I would be looking very forward to a discussion. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. I think that's a immensely stimulating paper, and I'm very glad that we got to share with the broader conference. And I think it will certainly factor into our discussion, literary discussion tomorrow afternoon. We have sufficient time for questions and discussion, which is wonderful. So I think there's lots to say in response to that. Can I have hands up here if you have a question? We have one there and then one there. We'll start.
Thank you, Dennis. That was interesting. I was quite struck by one phrase, I think it's in Livy 1:25:2, where the word spectaculum appears. And it's a non gratum spectaculum, right? An unpleasant one. A rather disenchanting phrase, it seems to me. So, how does this work? Is this part of this ambivalent strategy of also giving a perspective on the victim's position? What does it do when we hear this non-gratum spectaculum right at the beginning of the story?
Yeah, thank you. I think from a kind of historical point of view, you could say many people have claimed that the model for this description is an actual gladiatorial fight. And then a Roman audience would be sitting there enjoying the pure spectacle, so it has nothing to do with them. It's just a show. And the point that Livy wants to make in this story once and again is that the fight that is taking place there has consequences. The idea is that the winner will rule over the loser for the time being, and so this is stressed repeatedly, that it is not a pure entertainment for them. But then I would say watching a football match is almost never pure entertainment for someone sympathizing with one of the teams. Yeah? So you have always your stakes in what is happening there. Perhaps we should not overemphasize this difference. And if you take it from a more literary point of view, I think it points at exactly this ambivalence. It is the close connection between enchantment and shock, to use Felski's categories, that you can have both in one, even if this seems paradoxical at first sight.
Thank you.
I think we have a question.
Thank you very much. It's really great. I'm also really glad to hear a German admits that watching football is not pure pleasure for you. But my question is still a bit about the transference of the model for fiction to historiography. You said a bit about it, but I wonder whether you could elaborate a bit more, both kind of maybe your own point of view, but also from ancient theorizing. I'm thinking of Maroncola's, that sort of book. Ancient theorizing is shock. I also think of Ankersmith, for example, is shock, is enchantment. You can think of Huizinga. Are these forms of historical knowledge? It seems to me that this knowledge category in Felski's thing, which I can see why you have that for fiction, does interfere a bit because it seems to oppose historical knowledge to other forms of historical experience. So how do you see that, and how do you think someone like Livy might have thought about what is then historical knowledge of knowing historically?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm not sure if in the 2008 book Rita Felski really has this in mind when she talks about knowledge. Her problem is she's talking really about fictional texts. So what kind of knowledge can we get from a fictional world? So we have tried to say a bit about it, but it's more complex, because in historiography we would have this element of learning facts, so to say, about the past. But the more interesting point is to learn via emotions, so to say. And I'm completely with you that this is something that historians in our days have in a way rediscovered. When we are going back to the 50s or the 19th century, they would have said, no, learning from history is about reason. And nowadays we would say, if we want to, for certain things that we want to learn and know about the past, we cannot do it without relive the emotional experience. And in a way, then we are there again where ancient historians had been all the time, and Livy would fit perfectly in. I think he would fit even more perfectly in with the books we cannot read anymore, because the closer he comes to his own times and the traumata of the Civil War, I think we will have used more of these enchantment and shock things than even in these prehistoric times, which indeed are far away from him and his audience. Thanks.
We have a question just back there. But I would also like to point out, we, the panel organizers tonight, were in touch with Rita Felski, and she said she was absolutely thrilled about our panel, and we'll be in future discussions about whether, if we publish something coming from this panel, whether she contributes enough to it. So there's approval there as well, which is lovely. We'll go to the question about.
Thank you for that wonderful talk. My question actually is a response to what Luke just asked, that I just wanted to sort of throw out as a suggestion, which is that one way that you could see this embedded in ancient theories of historiography is to read very precisely against what Olivia says about Arthas, because they're used precisely the model of trial. And Olivia's point is that if you read a display of emotions, you won't be able to judge precisely the who's will consider causes and effects, etc. Yet Livy has presented a case where you can't, where the causes are ambiguous, and where in fact it is the father's speech on behalf of his child that ends up being decisive and being persuasive. So I think that this is a real place where he is thinking with a whole tradition of historical knowledge and complicating and reversing what we might have seen as I'm sorry, that wasn't a question, it's just a contribution.
Thank you very much. I totally agree.
Do we have another question?
Here, this sir.
Well, thank you very much, Dennis. Small comment and a question. The could we not also read the unpleasing spectacle as Livy already pointing to the killing of the sister? So
To the?
to read the unpleasing spectacle as Livy already pointing to the killing of the sister. So he's taking, because it's still in front of everyone, so it's still, you could read it as part of the spectacle, kind of. That's the common. Then the question, what about the trumpets? I mean, given your question of Livy wanting to sell as many scrolls as possible, I mean, he could have said, then sounded the trumpets, and then the scroll descends, and then everyone has to buy the second scroll. I mean, would it be possible for him to include it? I'm curious. I don't think so, because the trumpets, they need a set of rules, a set of authorities who can decide, and who would that be in this kind of state where there isn't a state, so there are no rules. But I'm curious on your view.
Yeah. To your comment, to include already the killing of the sister in this, then a kind of preview, it never occurred to me, because my impression is he wants to present it as something unexpected. But on a second level, this might be there also. And of course, the decisive point is that we have at least 3 different internal audiences. We have the one watching the fight, we have the one watching the killing, and we have more or less 2 in the trials. I think that's and you could argue that there is a continuation of spectacular. The other thing is I always thought it would be very nice if Livy would have been the inventor of the cliffhanger, so to say. So presenting a story right at the end of the scroll so that we need to buy the next one and to see how it continues. Then the kind of structure of thematical units he uses is in a way a counter argument, at least for the parts that we can still read. It is a very difficult question if the lost parts of his work really had been structured in the same way or not. So perhaps he might have been the inventor of the cliffhanger at some later stage, but we cannot prove it. This could have done by different techniques, of course. The trumpets might have been only one of them. If you refer to concrete situation, I must confess they are in a way a counter argument, because you see that the hold of the action, the pause, was not coming from itself, but there was an external element, and this is missing in the triple duel. And the argumentation would only be that before killing an opponent who is not able to fight anymore, there might be a moment of reflection appropriate. And this connects the situation to other famous scenes like the killing of Turnus in the Aeneid, where you can argue, or it has been done actually in a similar way, to say that if this would have been a gladiatorial fight, why is there no consideration of an external judgment?
We have time, I think, for one more question. Just
Yeah, thank you for a very interesting talk. So I have a question about, how you were saying in this battle, and then the later interfamilial, inter-civil strife. Is there since this was written during the so-called Pax Romana, this whole history, do you think Livy is making some counter-Augustan comment on, this within the so-called Pax Romana? There's some loss as well. It's not just this perfect pax.
Yeah, that is one of the big questions in Livian studies, how we deal with Augustus. I've put him in the end of the paper, so to say, to signal that I have thought about it, and questions are welcomed to this topic. But of course, it's a really difficult one. The main thing for me is that my impression is that Livy tends to complicate the stories. And my view of Augustus would be to make them as simple as possible. So Horatius is the victor who won the case for the Romans, and Livy's tendency to problemize the examples, I think, is an anti-Augustan approach in a way. Although I would not go so far to say that it's outright opposition, but it's a different dealing with history than I think Augustus has had in his mind when he constructed something like the Forum Augustum, which is much more straightforward, celebrating the heroes and not problematizing them.
Thank you very much, and let's thank Professor Dr. Pausch. Thanks to the organisers of the 16th Celtic Conference in Classics and to the University of Marburg for hosting us and our panel and honouring our panel in this way. So thank you very much to them as well. And I believe that in 20 minutes we have the family photo outside of the Royal Palace, which is a 2-minute walk, I think. So thank you very much, and I'll see you there.